I'm thinking of Abbey Road as the last Beatles album. And as I've said in the videos leading up to this point, Let It Be is actually released after Abbey Road, but most of it's recorded before. And so as we follow the development of the group, really Abbey Road is the place where if we're going to say something about how the group either has changed a ton since we first saw them back in 1962, 1963, or they've begun to synthesize things, or whatever's going to happen. This is the place to look for some of those kinds of things. And in fact, I will argue that a lot of interesting things happen in Abbey Road and make it a fitting finale for perhaps one of the top pop groups in the history of at least 20th century popular music. Let's take a look a little bit at what was going on in the biography of the group, just to remind ourselves of what was happening through the second half of 1969, or at least in the period during which this album was being recorded, February through August of '69. Apple Corps continued to lose money through 1969, becoming a pressing problem. How much money, if you were the Beatles, how much money would you have to be losing for that to constitute a problem? I mean, they had making tons and tons of money. If you're losing money and you're the Beatles, you've got to stop that. And they saw that as a really pressing problem. Recommended to them came a guy by the name of Alan Klein, a manager, recommended to them by the Rolling Stones, who they had told the Beatles had really helped them clean up a lot of the business end of what was going on with their music. And so the three Beatles, John and Ringo and George, decided they wanted Alan Klein to manage the group. But Paul wanted his father-in-law, Lee Eastman, to manage the group, or at least the group's finances. Paul and the other guy said, well, we don't think that's quite fair, Paul. If the guy who's managing the group is like your father-in-law, that doesn't seem like it would totally be fair. Well, Paul, I don't care. I don't like this Alan Klein guy. I don't like the law. I don't like being pushed into this kind of thing. So there was a real standoff between Paul and the other three guys. So what ended up happening is the three of the Beatles signed a management deal with Alan Klein, and Paul did not. And because the other guys did, and because Alan Klein was coming in to clean up the mess at Apple, Paul basically withdrew from Apple. He'd been there all the time up to that point. He'd been the only guy who was showing up with a great regularity, been very, very involved. But when it didn't work out the way he hoped, he became disappointed and dispirited about that, and decided he would invest his time other ways. And so he went away from Apple, and Alan Klein sort of took over the show for a while. So this, again, the seeds of what's going to become the final breakup of the group has to do with the business, and this even more gives us a sense of what George Harrison must have been thinking when he wrote I, Me, Mine. Anyway, we come to the album Abbey Road. And as we've said before, recorded during February and August of 1969 and released in August of '69, a month earlier in the UK, September. It rose, of course, to #1 on both sides of the Atlantic in the US and the UK after the great fiasco of Get Back, which they expected most of that music would never see the light of day that they'd recorded in the month of January. They decided to return to the EMI Abbey Road studios and do an album the way they used to, with George Martin once again producing. George Martin kind of had to be talked into it. But he could believe that Paul wanted to go back to doing that, but the relationship with John had gotten to this point over the Get Back project that he wasn't sure that John actually wanted him back. But Paul assured him that they wanted him back. John assured him they wanted him back, so George Martin came back, and they did an album in Abbey Road just like they had done almost all of the times before. The way they decided to work it out, Paul had this idea that he wanted to do a big kind of piece that put together a lot of different pieces or fragments. And John Lennon just wanted to do his songs. So the way they made peace between John and Paul was they decided that side one would be done pretty much the way every other Beatles album had been done, Rubber Soul or Revolver or something. They'd just be a sequence of tunes. Side two, Paul would get to weave together various tunes to create the big, what we now think of as Abbey Road Side 2, that big sort of piece that's put together of other smaller songs. And so the first side was done in a very traditional way, and the second side became a kind of an enlarged version of A Day in the Life, now with several songs being put together to create one big coherent thing, as opposed to just two songs, a John song and a Paul song. And so as we do our discussion of this, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the George songs first, and then I'll talk through side one. We'll do a close-up of some songs from side one and a George song. And then we'll look at side two. And when we look at side two, that discussion will almost in itself be a kind of song close-up, because it's very, very difficult to pull any of that material out of side two once you get past Sun King, say, and really be fair to the whole thing. So that's the way we'll proceed. Let's then talk a little bit about the George songs and the Ringo song. The two George songs on this album, Something and Here Comes the Sun, are, well, maybe in some people's opinion, the best songs that George Harrison has written with the Beatles so far. Some people would argue that these songs are maybe the best songs on the record. That we can even have such a discussion, again, reminds us of how far George Harrison has come as a songwriter in the time he's been with the Beatles, and how far his songwriting has come. He's really become a very accomplished pop songwriter, maybe more accomplished than many others who are having hits in the business at the same time. The song Something actually appears to be inspired by a line in a James Taylor song. The James Taylor song, I think, is called Something in the Way She Moves. Obviously, you can hear where that line may have come from. It's kind of a happier, While My Guitar Gently Weeps. A lot of people think of Something as maybe being the best George Harrison song ever. I think the story goes that Frank Sinatra often called it his favorite Lennon and McCartney tune. So there you go. Way to go, Frank. Anyway, it's a modified AABA form, and you've probably heard the song a million times. A great guitar solo, beautiful vocal, and all that kind of thing. But if you've never taken time to do it, I would recommend you take a little bit of time to listen to Paul McCartney's bass playing on this tune. It's almost like Paul decided, well, I'm not going to get to do much singing on this tune. It's already a pretty good tune. He just needs me on bass, so I'm really going to focus on this bass part. It is just wonderful bass playing. And whenever you think about bass players into the 1970s who do much more sort of adventurous things in playing the bass than bass players had tended to do in the 60s, you got to look back at this Paul McCartney track and think, well, I'll bet they were listening to this. People like Michael Rutherford and Chris Squire and others who played in a lot of the progressive rock bands in the 70s, no doubt listened very carefully to what Paul was doing on this track, as well as a lot of other things he was doing on Abbey Road. The other song, Here Comes the Sun, written on one of Eric Clapton's guitars during the first moments of spring, we'll talk about in one of our song close-ups coming up, so I'll save my remarks on that one. Just while we're talking about it with regard to Something, let me point out that both of these songs are AABA forms, and so there really seems to be a sense in which George is coming to a kind of a mastery of traditional songwriting forms and techniques here in a way that he's been working up to now for the last couple albums that we've been talking about. Well, we get a chance to talk about this for the second time, a Ringo song from the Beatles, and that is Octopus's Garden, one of the few Ringo songs, clearly country tinged, related in many ways to Yellow Submarine, a kind of a continuation of the Yellow Submarine idea. Yellow Submarine, of course, had been a Paul song, but still, an Octopus's Garden. It's an AABA form, so it's a fairly traditional kind of song form. And Ringo tells the story that it was inspired by him going on a trip and somebody, a tour guide or something, telling about how these octopuses would collect together various kinds of shiny objects and create little sort of gardens on the bottom of the ocean that they would think of as their own little sort of gardens. The idea that these octopuses would collect together these various shiny objects and sort of maybe one might expect take some pride, the way some suburban types might in their lawn, or somebody might over their car, and here's a little octopus in the ocean taking pride over their garden. This Ringo found very enchanting, and so he wrote this song, and for a lot of people is one of the high points of the album. Well, let's now turn our attention to side 1 of Abbey Road, as we have a look at that side that, of course, was put together in a traditional way to please John Lennon, but features songs by all 4 of the Beatles.